All right. Well, thanks everyone for joining us today. Again, my name is Dan Meyer. I'm editor-in-chief of RCR Wireless News. Joining me today on a panel looking at the wireless network decommissioning space, here we go, will be Dan Hayes, who is a principal and, lost my thing, there we go, resume slideshow, sorry, who is a principal and U.S. Wireless Services Advisory Leader at PwC. Dan, thanks for joining us today. We appreciate it. Also joining us today is Carl Rex, who's a project manager at Black & Veatch Telecommunications. Carl, thanks for joining us today. We appreciate it. And also joining is Jorg Erlemeir, who's Vice President of Market Services for North America at Nokia. Jorg, thanks for joining us today. Also, we appreciate your taking the time today. All right. So we'll move along. Here's a quick intro on RCR Wireless News for those who perhaps do not have never heard of RCR Wireless News and just kind of come upon this webinar. We've been covering the wireless space for more than 30 years now. Obviously, kind of different variations of the market. It's coming along quite a bit from the two-way radio space back in the day to where we are today, but we've been covering it for quite some time. This webinar today is connected to a report we have coming out. It should be on our website later on today or first thing tomorrow, looking at the decommissioning market right now for wireless networks, challenges and opportunities as carriers move to the 4G space. And there's that right there. So again, you'll be able to check it out on our website. Should be there by tomorrow morning. All right. Well, we'll start off with I guess some big topics here when it comes to decommissioning. The report itself it goes into pretty in depth into some of these topics. With our panel members today, we'll be kind of going into similar directions, but also some different directions too. So the two kind of work together. So I would say that having the webinar and also the report is a good, at least a good way to get into the issue of network decommissioning. And what I want to start with is, I guess, start with Dan Hayes and maybe just get an overview of kind of where we are when it comes to decommissioning and perhaps why carriers are looking to decommission the legacy networks when it comes to moving towards next generation networks. So Dan, maybe I guess from your point of view, when as carriers are looking to do this, what is the reason that a lot of carriers have when it comes to decommissioning their legacy networks?
Sure, thanks, Dan. Yeah, no, network decommissioning is a topic that's just sort of really bubbled to the surface over the last couple of years. And it's one that, quite frankly, a lot of carriers have never really had to think about. The industry today is at a scale that no one has ever dealt with before, and whereas a few of the operators that have been around a long time have had to decommission, old analog cellular networks. No one has really had to do it as an industry where everyone that's out there has a mobile phone, and so we're seeing just a tremendous amount of interest in this topic from carriers all over the world, both here in the U.S., where we've been really at the front end of the curve in terms of deploying 4G, as your report talks about, but also in other countries, whether it's our friends in the north in Canada, operators even down in Latin America and in Europe that are looking at what are they going to have to do, and really there's a few reasons that are driving it. First of all, every operator hates to run multiple networks, right? It requires additional resources. It uses up your spectrum assets that you have. The newer technologies are so much more spectrally efficient that it really makes a huge difference if you can migrate people over to the newer technologies. And if you can get the newer generation of network equipment, you get a lot of operating efficiencies. It typically takes up less space. It requires less energy. It's all around more efficient. The final thing that we're seeing from the operator perspective also is some of their old networks are just starting to fail. The industry doesn't talk about this a lot, but we've got 3G networks now that in some cases the infrastructure is 10 to 15 years old, and like any good electronics, it starts to break down at that point in time. And so as a result, the replacement costs for those are going up and up and up. and it just becomes uneconomical to continue to support those networks, especially as the end users are demanding 4G speeds and beyond. So there's a lot of great drivers out there, and it's really now a topic that every operator we work with is thinking about in a big way.
Gotcha. Well, maybe Jorg, I guess, obviously you work at a big equipment vendor, working with most of the large carriers out there. I mean, are you guys seeing some demand from carriers when it comes to decommissioning? And I guess how are carriers coming to you and approaching, I guess that aspect of, taking down some of those older 2G and even 3G networks as they move to more efficient LTE technologies?
Yeah, thank you, Dan. Maybe just to add a couple of points actually to what Dan said before, about a new paradigm shift in the industry. I mean, I've been, you can hear it from my accent. I'm not from North America, so I have been around the world, and what I really have seen is actually that, of course, the original 2G as well as 3G technologies were not designed for large data, but rather actually voice consumption. Yeah. And I think this is driving, of course, one of the big shifts in the towards 4G, because the LTE networks which we are seeing here being deployed right now by the carriers are really designed for data usage, and the data storm and tornado actually, which is really out there and hitting us, is of course driving actually some of these capacity changes which are needed by the operators. When it comes to what the operators or the carriers actually demanding from our suppliers is very much actually related to footprint optimization, more spectrum efficiency, as Dan also mentioned before, and very often actually the approach to the decommissioning or deconstruction of the legacy technology networks is very different. I mean, and we see that also especially in the US. Some are doing it in modernization efforts, going actually to a single RAN technology, where they are combining actually the carriers in a smaller footprint cabinet, so that they can actually have OpEx efficiencies, and then actually utilize that more efficiently. But that brings also challenges, and I guess we're coming later to some of the challenges which we are seeing. So it's about modernization. It's about shifting from voice to data. That's what we largely see, and all of the operators are currently working through this challenge.
Gotcha. Now maybe from Carl, get your and obviously with Veatch, you're also on the vendor side and kind of working with carriers and also the equipment vendors, and actually doing a lot of the work when it comes to decommissioning. I guess what's from Veatch's point of view, what is the benefits for carriers when it comes to decommissioning these legacy networks in favor of some of the newer technologies?
Well, clearly, just to leverage on what we heard from the other participants, once you clear the way by decommissioning for footprint, they can deploy their newer technologies. But even more so, these networks, they're being sought to take out to save that operational expense in many cases. So the need is, get the equipment off, get the power bill stopped, get the backhaul bill stopped, and get that rent stopped. Those networks that are being decommissioned generally aren't producing enough to cover all that efficiently. So that's one of the big drives. And clearly the other big drive is where all the M&A, the merger and acquisition, has occurred, and you've got duplicate footprint. You just can't afford to run two networks. Sometimes, it depends on which M&A, right? Sometimes those will be similar technologies, and you just have to take out the overlap. In that case, you may have reuse and redeployment of the electronics, or in another case, you may have incompatible technology you can't blend together, and you want to take out the overlap of the inferior technology that won't be your long-haul partner there.
Yeah, and I know some of those topics we'll be touching on a little bit as we go through this, but obviously the M&A stuff is always fun to watch because seeing a CDMA carrier take out a GSM carrier the other way around. I think for a lot of us who kind of cover the technology side of things, I think our first question is always how are they going to handle that network transition? What's going to come down? What's going to stay up? And so that's kind of been, like you said, Carl, and I think Dan and Jorg also mentioned, it's kind of a big challenge for this. But well, I know with Dan Hayes, I know we've been. You've been covering this decommissioning aspect for several years. I know we've talked over the past couple of years on this. Have you seen, I guess, much of a change in the speed or the need for decommissioning? Obviously, it seems like this is something that's kind of been ramping up over time. Have we hit that inflection point, do you think, where it's becoming, I guess, more of a pressure point for carriers, or do you think it's still perhaps another year or two away before carriers start to really focus on this? And is it probably also dependent upon the carrier, I'm guessing, to an extent as well?
Yeah, when we first started looking at this about 2 years ago or so in a really meaningful way, quite frankly, it was a topic that most people didn't even know when you approached them what to say about it. But what we found, we did the first and really even to date the only big global study looking at the outlook for network decommissioning. And what that study showed was that within the span of about 5 years, and we're probably a year and a half or so into that period, that about 3/4 of the operators actually had a plan to decommission at least one of their networks. Mm-hmm. That's a big number. And that's on a global basis. I would say that in the more mature markets, the number is even higher. Now, there are a lot of things that are driving that. M&A is a great example where there's certainly always a need. But we've talked about the other issues. What's happening now, though, is it's getting real. We're getting to the point where actually there are a few operators that have now done it or are in the process of doing it. And people are taking and looking for lessons learned from those network decommissioning efforts. We had a great discussion on this actually last week at the Wireless Infrastructure Show down in Orlando, and I know RCR was there in force, and was part of this conversation as well. Really, the key in my mind is no operator builds an organization to take stuff apart. So most of them are ill-equipped to actually go and manage the logistics, the project management, the financial impacts, the asset tracking, all of the things you have to do to completely deconstruct a nationwide network in many cases. And so as a result, they're looking out to the industry, to the ecosystem for help in trying to figure out how do we address these problems. Because if you're going to do it once and it's not going to be another 5, 7, 8 years until you do the next one, there's no sense in building up an organization to go and do it yourself. But these are big, complicated efforts, right? These networks have been built up over 10, 15 years in many cases. And, as the team said, right, you want to stop the cost as quickly as possible. Yeah. So you want to deconstruct something quickly that you've spent a decade to build up. That's a huge challenge, and we're now seeing operators figuring out that they need to go out and get more assistance with that, and that they really need to not reinvent the wheel, but lean on the industry who can help them.
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, maybe Jorg, I guess your point of view on that. Obviously, working with all these vendors and Dan says and putting up these networks. Are you also is the conversation now turning to the point where it's about now taking those networks back apart, and how do you handle that conversation with the carriers?
I mean, as I said before, I mean, there are several attempts actually from the operators how to tackle it differently, right? I mean, one of the key things, of course, which is important for us suppliers is that we need to have a good methodology actually working with, the carriers and operators to find the best suitable methodology, which actually fits into their new build. First of all, cost-effective, cost-efficient. We are competing for the same time slots. Very often maintenance windows. We need to actually find methodologies also together with the operators of how to work, for example, with the tower companies, because if you decommission a network, actually it is somewhat a negative part of the site acquisition syndrome and permitting, if you think about it, right? Because you're taking something off the tower, hence the negotiation is the other way around. You're not adding something or adding money into their pocket, you're taking actually money away from them. So I think it's very important to find a strategy around that dynamic, because you consolidate, and consolidation very often means, from an efficiency perspective, that you have smaller footprints. Smaller footprints means less equipment very often. Less equipment means less revenue for those who own the efforts, the infrastructure and so forth. And the other challenge is, of course, that we are asked by actually by law in most countries, of course, that we have a green program or environmental friendly program to take back, whatever we are actually deploying and make a sustainable effort out of it. Means actually we have to have refurbishment or recycling, partnering ecosystems, which we are working so that we can actually take back the equipment, very often refurbish it, and sometimes reuse it also in areas of the world where it's still a technology actually worthwhile to deploy.
Yeah, it makes sense. Well, I guess maybe from Carl, obviously you're kind of more on the ground there at some of these sites too. I mean, are you seeing, I guess, this growing demand for this from carriers and from your customers as well? And how are you guys handling that growing demand?
Yeah, we expect, of course, we've had some activity, both in execution and proposal, but we expect, as Dan referenced, that 1 to 5 year time frame his study said. I think he's right on. I think that study will prove very accurate. There's carriers that had to move very aggressively, obviously Sprint being a great example, on a nationwide go with their IDEN platform. There's other carriers who I think are recognizing, as both Dan and Jorg have said, this is a different game. And intuitively, you think that taking a site down would be much easier than putting one up. But when you're doing it by the hundreds and thousands, it's very, very different than deploying a network, which is a game that Black & Veatch and many others have historically been in. So I think you're seeing other carriers right now kind of dip their toe in with a start, but they know that they're in a learning mode, and they're going to gather a lot of learnings and adjust it and then go out for the next phase of their decoms. And once they have that process done, which Dan had referenced earlier, I think you'll see the flow rate increase as we go. But we're still really on the front end of what does it mean to take down a national or a very wide regional network en masse. That's a brand new game, and I'm sure we'll get into some of the idiosyncrasies of that game in further topics here.
Yeah, definitely. Well, yeah, let's move on to the next slide here if I can try to do that. Let's see if I'm good at this or not. Next slide, there we go. Okay, yep. Is that the one I want? Oh, here's the one I want. Yes. So yeah, and that's I just touch on some of those topics as well. But and before we move on to this slide, though, I do want to remind those who are watching and listening in that if you do have any questions from our panel members, we're going to try to leave the last 10 minutes or so to get some questions there. There's a questions tab there on the GoToWebinar GoToMeeting control panel. Please feel free to send those in, and we'll try to get to those at the end as well. But as Carl said there, obviously, and you guys have kind of mentioned too that there are some ongoing efforts. There have been some efforts already in this. Obviously, it does seem like Sprint is perhaps, at least domestically, one of the most well-versed when it comes to network decommissioning efforts. Obviously, following up with their Nextel acquisition almost probably 8 years ago now, or probably more 10 years ago now, picking up Nextel and then running the two networks. Obviously, they decided at some point to take one of those down, so now they're kind of focused on their network vision program, and more recently talking about taking down their WiMAX services as well. So obviously they're kind of a big part of it. I don't know, Dan, maybe if you want to talk in some of those examples or maybe stuff you've seen that have been learned, I guess, in some of these organizations that have kind of gone through this process.
Yeah. Well, there's tons of learnings, and I'm sure that Carl and Jorg are going to have, some great perspectives on this as well. I'll just add a few things. So first of all, you look at who's already in the mix on this, who's doing decommissioning. We've talked about a couple of examples, and certainly M&A is a big driver of that. But it's not the case in every instance. So, for example, north of the border here in Canada, we're actually seeing the early stages of planning for some large-scale network decommissioning. And it's really being driven, as we talked about earlier, by the technology evolution and the desire not to run multiple networks simultaneously. That's been a big driver. In some markets, it's a bigger challenge. And I want to just make a point here because it's important not to lose sight of the customer in all of this, the end user. because they are the ones really impacted and who need to be managed through this process, because you can't do decommissioning if you still have customers on the network. It's just sort of a basic principle.
Well,
and so,
you can if you're Sprint, but anyway.
but the front, so the front end of this in terms of customer migration becomes a really big deal. And so like over in Europe, for example, we're seeing some early stage migration efforts to try and move the customers over to the next generation network so that you can be prepared to move this. And even here in the US, we've seen that happen. That can be a tough effort in and of itself before you even touch a piece of network equipment. And a few lessons learned. So the first one is, as you're doing that migration, one thing the carrier has to think about is thinning. These networks weren't built to scale all at once. They were filled in, and there were capacity sites added along the way. And so you can think of decommissioning as really just reversing and playing back the way that the networks were constructed. So in many cases, you thin the sites and can take out a fair percentage of them while leaving the network supporting the remaining customers for the time being. That's good in terms of getting your backhaul, your utilities, your lease costs, out of the way and scaled back to meet the customer demand. That's been one big learning so far. I think a second one has been that the market for resale of a lot of this equipment, especially the legacy technologies, IDEN, CDMA, WiMAX, that quite frankly aren't very popular anymore, the resale market has completely dried up. And even in the emerging markets where many of our clients are hopeful and think, well, gee, can't I just go put this stuff on eBay and it'll it'll show up in an emerging market? Well, the answer is no, because you've now got this next generation of more compact, more easy to manage, more energy efficient types of equipment, even if it's for those same technologies, that can be deployed in those emerging markets at a relatively low cost. And really the market has dried up. We were talking last week about even some of the residuals, right? Where can you get some values? For example, a lot of the legacy equipment is housed in shelters, whereas more modern equipment tends to be more self-contained. Well, if you've got 30,000, 40,000 shelters from your network in the U.S., probably in 1 week you flood the market and the market's gone. So we're seeing some innovative approaches now. People are saying, well, we're offering used shelters, those that can be moved, to local schools or municipalities or charities who might be able to use them for storage, and we can take a tax deduction on the donation that we're making and get the asset out of our hands at the same time. But for the most part, the electronics are winding up, with the recyclers, and I think, we'll talk a little bit in going forward about some of the dynamics of that. But those are just a few of the things I've observed so far.
Yeah. Maybe Jorg, maybe you've seen so far in some of these efforts when it comes to decommissioning. Obviously, the things that Dan touched on are huge parts of it. Obviously, I'm sure you've seen similar things too from your point of view.
Well, absolutely. Like Dan said, actually, we saw, I think, more refurbishing, kind of market actually a couple of years back. I mean, it was much more prevalent, at that time. And without singling out, countries here, but let's talk about the emerging economies around the world. Actually, I mean, all of them, like Dan said, all of them are looking actually for the most efficient and operationally efficient also. Equipment, and these are normally the newer technologies. They have a smaller footprint. I mean, energy access to energy is normally a problem in most of these markets, right? Yeah. Hence they are falling actually more for technologies which giving them smaller footprints, less power consumption, so that you can actually kind of circumvent actually the problem they really have in reality. So. Yeah, I agree. I mean at the end of the day, I think the whole challenge is all about life cycle management of these products and inclusive of the ancillary materials, like for example shelters and so forth. We need to find ways actually of finding the best use of that material and creating value out of that. So it's really a recycling job. It's I mean, this industry becomes, it's almost like the car industry in essence, actually. It becomes a huge scale, recycling operation as well. And that is something which we need to, move towards. And like Dan said, I mean, we don't have our head around this yet, right? I mean, this is just the initial stages. And very often what we see on sites also is that decommissioning, by the way, actually, I mean, on this slide you're saying, I think, the right thing, deconstruction of the wireless network, because it is that decommissioning and the deinstallation. The decommissioning work is not such a big issue, because very often we have seen in the modernization waves that the operators go out there and they just shut down the equipment and power up the new equipment, hence actually migrating just to the new technology if they have not done a full modernization of the whole footprint, but rather an overlay network. Yeah. And the install of that whole equipment is an altogether different challenge. Like I said before, you need to renegotiate. You have a different negotiation tactic to apply. You have to find ways actually of finding low-cost entry actually points into taking down the equipment. Means very often they are waiting for the next time they are going anyway to that site or going anyway to that tower to, then at the same time take the old antenna down or something like that. And the challenge is very different in terms of project management, program management, and life cycle management actually of the whole network. So it will cause also great opportunities in terms of creating business, because every challenge creates an opportunity for someone, in the value chain, and we need to figure out, how do we, as an industry, resolve this challenge.
Yeah. Well, I think obviously it does seem like one issue that's come along here is that there are these challenges actually out at the tower site. I know, Carl, I know I've talked to you a bit of the report I did on this, kind of on some of these issues, and maybe it's a good point here to touch on some of those. So I don't know, Carl, if you want to kind of bring in some of the points that you had made about when it comes to program management and kind of scheduling and stuff, when it comes to actually working on these sites and bringing in new equipment, taking old equipment. I guess some of the challenges that you're seeing that carriers are facing or need to kind of prepare for when they're working on these decommissioning efforts.
Sure, I'd like to share a few of our experiences with you. I can tell you, listening to Dan and Jorg, you guys have clearly been watching as these early efforts went, because I hear the shelter discussion, and I've lived through a lot of that. I mentioned that intuitively, to decom a site sounds easy relative to building one, but some of the challenges that we hit that changed our mind on that. A decom effort will have two aspects, a site act portion and then an execution or deconstruction portion. And I will tell you, it's imperative to do your homework on the front end of the project and get ahead on that site act. The site act scope, which is really negotiating with landlords, whether it be private landlords or tower company mass landlords. Make sure that you have the volume pre-negotiated so that when you send your crews into the field, they've got a backlog within a clustered geographic area to start and keep busy. Otherwise, you'll lose your crews. Additionally, you got to make sure that you get far enough ahead on that site acquisition effort with the landlords and the jurisdictions, because the negotiating for lease terminations and the permitting with difficult jurisdictions can be quite a long cycle time. And once again, you want to issue a notice to proceed to your deconstruction crews that is totally clean. That is one of the most important things, I think, is give yourself enough lead time on the front to get a systematic site act head start before you field your crews. And it may sound very obvious, but you have to take seasonality into account. If you plan a high run rate of sites per month and you have northern sites in the plan for winter deconstruction, you will experience a problem with Mother Nature at some point. Some winters are worse than others, but try not to plan a lot of northern activity with high rates of completion for wintertime. It sounds obvious. It's really important. Another thing is, especially with private landlords, make sure the concept of the scope to be deconstructed is common between both the carrier, the construction contractor, and the landlord. Any little wiggle room there often goes to the landlord and throws extra cost upon those doing the construction. Landlords who have expectations of a whole new roof on a sizable building isn't really realistic, and it causes problems during the execution, and especially the closeout portion of a project. So that scope setting is very important.
Yeah, and I thought that seasonality aspect that you mentioned was interesting. I know we talked, I was doing the report, and you brought that part of it, and like you said, it does seem like an obvious part, but it didn't, obviously I'm not in that space, so it didn't really cross my mind, but I mean, that seems like such an obvious thing that can really bog down a nationwide decommission. I mean, like you said, if you've got northern towers that you've got to try to decommission, you got a bad storm, you got tower crews sitting around at hotels waiting for work to happen. So it seems to mess up.
Yeah, it's all phased upon when the negotiations with the landlord completes. Typically, you'll want to go as soon as that landlord will give you the green light. And if the negotiations stretch a bit, that can drive you into winter whether you wanted it to or not.
Yeah.
So you really best plan for that in the front end of the project and try to target around it. And the best laid plans will go awry.
Yeah, well, I know, Dan, I know with the report you guys put out, I know you guys touched on a lot of those issues as well. I mean, it does seem like that it obviously, I didn't notice it, that's not a big deal, but it does seem like that's a pretty important part of it. It seems like you guys were kind of on top of that as well, that's an important aspect of doing these decommissions is the program management part of it. I know you guys work with some companies on that part as well. It seems like a pretty important part for you too.
Yeah, I mean, it's incredibly complicated, right? You're talking about tens of thousands of individual projects, and just coordinating the planning and logistics for that, the volumes. I mean, I'll just share a few sort of snippets of stories that we've heard and come across of things that have happened, along the way, and challenges that people have faced. A lot of them, to folks who are in the site development space, are familiar in the reverse, but they don't think about this happening with network decommissioning. So first one, to add to weather, I'll put on top of that migratory birds. You wouldn't believe the number of decommissioning efforts that we've had problems with, where there have been migratory birds nesting in towers, on rooftops, etc., and have completely put a hold on the decommissioning effort because you can't disturb them. Another one that came up in last week's discussion was high incidence of theft. The thieves have started to figure out when networks are getting turned down, as was mentioned earlier, and they're realizing, hey, this stuff isn't live anymore, and it's now high stakes for copper theft in particular. And so, people are showing up, and assets have been damaged, assets have been stolen, especially, sort of high-grade coax.
Yeah.
Those are all challenges. The other one that's happening, and we heard it earlier here as well. Carl mentioned, getting alignment with the landlord is extremely, extremely important. We are hearing stories of guns being drawn on crews. We are hearing stories of landlords parking trucks across access roads and not enabling crews to get to sites. Everything you could imagine and then some is happening for this. Assuming you can get past those things, the really important part then is to know what you're going after. And unfortunately, a lot of the carriers aren't really that meticulous or perfect about their asset tracking systems, and we're starting to see them get a little wiser to this. So, for example, in a lot of the decommissioning efforts that we're involved in now, we're helping the operators put in place some predictive analytics to look for how many pounds of copper coax should be coming back off of an individual site. Is it walking away and becoming beer money for the local crews? There's a lot of that happening. And now you can take advantage of that, right? As we said earlier, right, every challenge creates an opportunity. So one of the more creative things we're seeing people do right now is offer up abandoned in place, offerings to site owners. Right? Let them hang on to the asset. When that next crew comes out, drop a little extra money to them and let them take the stuff down and deal with disposal of it, especially, items that are on the tower. It may be a little different for, active equipment that's on the base. But, if you can go with an abandoned in place strategy, let them take that several $1,000s of copper coax and use that to help fund it, and it's a cost that a carrier perhaps doesn't have to incur. So there's a lot of that kind of creativity going on, trying to look at some new business models for this so that there's some things to offset the cost. Because let's face it, no one likes to pay the cost of building the network. They sure don't like to pay the cost of taking it apart.
True. Good points there. Yeah, that's definitely a good point. Well, I definitely want to touch a little bit on the recycling aspect there. Maybe have Jorg come in on the recycling part. Before we go to that, though, I do want to make sure that those who are watching, if you do have any questions for our panel members, please feel free to use the questions tab there on the GoToMeeting control panel, and you can send those questions in. We'll leave the last 10 minutes or so to get some of those questions too. But Jorg, yeah, maybe bring you on a bit. I know you touched a little bit earlier on kind of the recycling, refurbishing aspect of it. I guess the importance of that you're seeing from your customers, and I guess some efforts that are being put into that. What are you guys doing in that space?
Yeah, I think there is two aspects to this. I mean, one is the let's call it now the product itself. We are suppliers actually producing. So I think there is an inherent actually kind of environmentally friendly policy already around that. So we do know actually to the last bolt and to the last item which we have actually inside our products, actually where it's coming from, what material it is, how do we take it back throughout our chain, and then backwards, take it apart or refurbish, or as we heard before, refurbishing and reusing seems actually not so easy anymore as it has been a couple of years back. But recycling is still a big business as well, and a lot of this material can be reused. So I think from a product perspective, there's a lot which can be done. Then laid out. I mean, I think they sound funny, but these stories are all very true. And I think the ancillary materials of cables, the copper, the batteries. I mean, they have an altogether very different kind of environmental policy around them. Actually, how do you need to handle those? How do you take them back? And we are working, of course, here with service providers which can do life cycle management actually in these particular areas, be it third party providers who do this actually for a living, or companies actually which can recycle, save, and so forth. So I think that, and we are not unique. I mean, as Nokia, I really have to stress the point. This is for all suppliers the same. I think we are all under the kind of environmental policies actually our companies have, and the partner ecosystem is existing, and we're just actually now reutilizing. I think we're reviving maybe actually a part of the industry which has been a niche play, so to say, for some time. But I would think here, especially in North America, that for the next couple of years or so, actually, it can be quite substantial business for some small to medium size enterprises.
Yeah, interesting. Well, maybe Carl. I mean, obviously you do a lot of work kind of on the ground there, and have to kind of implement a lot of these recycling or reusing, refurbishing efforts. Are you seeing, I guess, how is that being handled on the ground level? I mean, obviously there's a lot of, carriers like to talk, and perhaps my cynical side would say, hey, it's a lot of talk, and is there really any action going on out there? But I mean, are you seeing on the ground that there is this big push for reusing and trying to get as much value as you can back out of the equipment that's coming out of the towers?
Yeah, absolutely, Dan. The recycling, and we prefer to call it reverse logistics because you're really starting at the site, and it's the act of removing all that material. And given that there are hazardous type materials that need tracking, such as batteries, maybe some fluids off the site, etc., you really do have to have a partner who will work with you to remove it, track it, participate in tracking systems, and then responsibly recycle it. Black & Veatch is a very sustainability-focused company, and thankfully the carriers are generally that way too. So we have common interest there in doing this right. But what really makes it work, and I think both Dan and Jorg alluded to it, is there's money in this that can really offset the cost of the decom. It's not just beer money that should be going in somebody's pocket. So how do you do it? There are responsible recyclers out there, lots of them. They're certified for environmentally handling things correct and zero landfill type operations. There are different standards. There's the Bainey Stewart standard, and there's responsible recycling R2 standards. And there's plenty of those companies out there, but what you really want to do is focus on the few that know telecom. That's very critical. And then your whole reverse logistics plan starts at the site and ends with destruction certificates in your hand for equipment you know you gave them. And nothing should be going in the landfill if you do it right. Right down to, you think that coax and steel, there's things that are obvious recycling targets. Batteries actually are very valuable recycling targets. But then you get to a shelter, and there's certain things you're going to spend money to recycle. But what else do you do with it when the market saturates in the very early part of a huge decom, and it will? You have to be able to then say, what do you do with things that won't sell and can't be used elsewhere? Even shelters have to be taken apart, and there's steel in there, there's concrete in there, that's all recyclable. So you've got to find the right partners. Factor in that moving this material is not free. It's very expensive, and the goal here is for the recycling revenue to help offset those freight costs and neutralize the impact. You don't think about moving the material off the site as being a big piece of the cost to decom a network, but it really is. It's not just the labor that goes onto the rooftop or onto the tower. The back side of this can cost a lot of money. The way to make that affordable is to make sure you have a good recycling plan.
Yeah. I mean, obviously, I don't know the report. We kind of touched on this a little bit more as well, but I know some things I noticed from talking to people was, just that fact that the previous views of, you just resell this stuff into emerging markets is just not a viable option anymore, because a lot of these emerging markets now don't want 2G equipment. They want the latest stuff too, and so it's not quite the open market as it perhaps used to be. So a lot of balances when it comes to that aspect.
And believe it or not, you have to be careful on selling off the recycling materials to emerging markets in order to be compliant with the standards, the responsible recycling standards. So you have to watch where your partners are sending that raw product.
Yeah, and just to add to that, our sustainability team has actually been hired by some of the operators now to audit all the way down the supply chain and to ensure that actually stuff is going there. And what we're seeing is they're not only doing it, but they're using that information to then award additional decommissioning dollars to those who are actually the most compliant and who are using the responsible green recyclers. And where there have been compliance issues, they're actually punishing those suppliers. So it's a very important aspect for the ongoing relationship with the operator.
And Black & Veatch was happy to participate in one of your audits. It was actually a good experience.
There you go. See, synergy. We get synergy going on here.
There you go.
Very nice. Very nice. Well, no, and again, like you said, kind of Dan too. I mean, there are national security issues as well when it comes to equipment that has to make sure that where it goes. You have to make sure you track it to where it goes at the end of the road too. So there's a lot of challenges there. That's obviously a big part of it as well. Well, we're getting a little bit low on time here. I do want to remind those who are watching that we are going to try to get some questions here at the end. So if you do have any questions for our panel members, use that questions tab there on the GoToMeeting control panel there. But before we do have a couple more topics, but we probably have time for maybe just one more. I did want to touch a bit on the impact that decommissioning is having on the MCM space and also enterprise customers. I know in the report that we put together, this was kind of a big part of it as well, that there are issues when it comes to, how this is going to impact embedded services that are already out there. You turn off the 2G network, kind of like you guys had mentioned, there's kind of that aspect of having to deal with the current customers on that network. I don't know, Dan, I know we talked a bit about this at one point as well too. want to get your views on kind of how the industry is handling that aspect of being able to, get rid of these networks, but have to do it in a responsible way so you're not just cutting off customers out there.
Yeah, so Dan, I mean, in many ways, the enterprise customers are like the forgotten network out there. They are often the ones that need the network to be maintained and to hang on to it, especially if they've got in-building systems or M2M systems where they've built services and applications on top of the network.
Yeah.
These can be, pretty tricky. The good news is that from an enterprise customer perspective, they've got an ongoing relationship, and so getting in to go and take out the equipment, do an upgrade is there. But if you think about it, many of the large operators have thousands of in-building systems that they have installed to improve coverage, whether it's in a factory, a shopping mall, a stadium, whatever it may be. And every one of those is another project. And you got to coordinate that with the customer. You have to make sure that anything they've built onto it is there, and you got to make sure that they're upgraded ahead of time to the latest technology. That's a big challenge, and the lead times for those can be really long. That's why what we're seeing is people start those discussions typically 2 to 3 years in advance, which sounds like a ludicrously long time frame, but you really have to do that because if you're talking about someone who's got to upgrade an entire set of devices, has got to swap out embedded systems or embedded modules and M2M systems, there's a long time for them to do that, and that's a significant cost. If you don't do it, the impact is you wind up either having to go through some really hard contract negotiations, you induce churn in the customer base because they're going to use that as an opportunity to go somewhere else, or in the worst case, we've seen some of the operators actually have to pay off enterprise customers to get them off the network and break their contract because they were going to incur costs to have to redevelop services and applications that were riding on the legacy network. So it's a real big problem, and it's really hidden within the industry.
Yeah. Now, maybe Jorg, I guess, maybe from Nokia's point of view, how are you guys able to work with carriers when it comes to making sure that, when they do move to these new networks, that they're somehow able to migrate those 2G guys, maybe thin the network a bit to still have services for the 2G guys? I mean, how do you guys work with the carriers? Are you seeing some effort by carriers to make sure they are able to continue servicing some very valuable customers?
Yeah, no, absolutely. First of all, I mean, I can only say this is I think Dan, you called it the kind of forgotten part actually of the challenge, right? But I fully agree. I mean, so we have solutions, and we can only do our little part. I have to say, actually, in the end-to-end, actually, play the carrier has there with the enterprises. Very often, these are like Dan said, also. I mean, over decades almost built, kind of relationships and systems which have evolved. We do whatever we can in terms of planning and optimization services and our system integration services, tools, technologies, which we can actually help them to migrate actually some of this and anticipate it. We do a lot of work around the in-building solutions, a lot of DaaS solutions and so forth together with the customer, but it's not an easy one. I mean, it's again like Dan also outlined. It's another project, right, on top of the other projects. It's maybe a more positive one because it's not actually taking a network out. It is actually migrating something to a new technology, but it's equally challenging and very often involving actually a lot of cost from the carrier side as well, a lot of planning efforts, and of course a lot of convincing also. I mean, you're dealing here with enterprise customers which are used maybe to a technology which works for them perfectly fine since years, right? And suddenly you're saying actually, look, I mean, what you have used yesterday is tomorrow not fashionable anymore, but I give you the same, more or less the same or an equal, kind of service, but you have to, go through a 6-month complete, kind of change cycle, and that is challenging. I mean, take for example the Nextel, push-to-talk customers, a very big loyal base actually, Sprint, acquired at that time. It's not easy, of course, to change, this base out to migrate them actually to a newer technology. So we do only, what we can do to work together with the carriers, hopefully to ease that pain. but it has to be planned, it has to be addressed, it has to be addressed early, and there is money involved. At the end of the day, of course, enterprise customers are very, very crucial, especially to the big carriers, and I think it's very important actually that they are staying as a valuable customer for a long time.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I'm sure a lot of enterprise customers were happy with the CDP for a long time too, and probably still wish it was still around probably. But it does seem like at least some of the new equipment going out, the LTE equipment can also support 2G systems and 3G systems too. So it seems like the new equipment is much more adaptable to be able to support legacy stuff too, which probably helps out the transition as well too. So well, we've got about almost 10 minutes to go. I do want to get some questions. And we've got some questions that have come in, so I have to thank our watchers for sending those in. One of them I wanted to get to, and I hope we touched a bit on it during the presentation too, was someone asking about the restoration issue. Because I guess when it comes to going back into the site and making sure that the site owner, if it's on a building or wherever it is, kind of make sure that they're happy at the end of the day. Because again, if they're not happy, there's probably some issues that can crop up. Maybe from Carl, I guess, I know you talked a little bit about kind of the issue when it comes to restoration. I know when we talked in the report, one of the things you brought up was, a site owner might think that, that when the equipment is taken back out of a site, that it's renewed to its as new condition before before the equipment was installed. But who was around 20 years ago when the stuff was installed to know what was the as new condition? So I guess how is that part tackled, and how can you look at that restoration applications?
Well, I tell you, it's a very difficult issue, and that's exactly why I said that in the site act portion, it is so important to set the same expectation with the landlord, with the GC who's going to do the work, or the infrastructure vendor, as well as the jurisdiction and the permitting. Because they'll also be a problem at the end if it's not done right and tell you to come back.
Yeah.
Restoration can be, as I term sometimes, you're going by braille, you're feeling your way along, because if it's not defined, you're going to give it a shot, and then it depends on who the landlord is, how cooperative or uncooperative they want to be, how much they'll continue to demand, and they'll start nickel and diming you if you can't draw a line and say we're done. So restoration, I would say, recall also where I mentioned that a lot of carriers, I think, are kind of dipping their toe in with a slower start, going to learn their lessons in the first round and go. I think restoration is one of those lessons everyone's figuring out how to deal with. It can be very expensive. It can be very undefined. You don't want to, repairing a parapet wall versus replacing a parapet wall, two very different things. And it's very different, I will tell you, for a permitting jurisdiction in a place like New York City or other tough environments like that. So restoration is one of the most difficult parts of the job, I think. You can tell what equipment has to come off the roof, but how far do you go on repairing it? And Dan, your point is exactly right. When most leases say restore to original condition, and not even the landlord was party to that original condition, it's just the food fight at the end.
Yeah, the owner could be like, well, hey, it was originally gold-plated up there, so
exactly.
It's gold-plated now. So
that's right.
That's obviously a challenge when it comes to that. So interesting. Well, another topic that we didn't get a chance to get to, but I think Jorg kind of touched on it a bit. Someone was asking about, not just the actual physical equipment, but kind of when it comes to almost the core equipment as well. Someone's asking, what's the challenge when it comes to decommissioning the legacy core stuff, stuff that's perhaps not on a site, but perhaps inside of a telecom operator's operations. I guess what's the challenges in that? I know we didn't touch much on that, but I don't know if someone has any insights on perhaps when it comes to, getting away from the sites and actually taking apart other parts of the network. Maybe
Dan.
Yeah.
I'm glad to share some perspectives on that. I mean, decommissioning the core goes hand in hand with decommissioning the radio net side of the network, and I think we're seeing a lot of activity there. And by the way, it's not just on the wireless side, but also on wireline networks. We're seeing as the demand of those networks has diminished, they're going through that thinning or consolidation that's taking place and having to decommission their core network as well. The challenge with the core network is a little different. Right? Obviously, it's easier to get your hands on. In most cases, you have more control of access to facilities and such. And the scale, of course, is better. But the challenge for the operators in particular is, as you start to thin these things, going through and rehoming networks. If you're taking out 20% of switches, for example, you've got to rehome things to switches, and in many cases you're doing partial decommissioning of a facility, and now you've got the overhead of managing a facility that's not at capacity. So I was down at one recently, for example, that used to be a very robust switch site, where you walked into a room that I don't even know, it was probably at least a couple thousand square feet, if not bigger, and it literally had like 9 racks of equipment in it. And you look at it and you say, well, they're paying for security, for HVAC, for all of the things for that site, and it's not even at 10% of its capacity. So it's a big challenge, but we're seeing people moving aggressively to decom the core network, just in parallel with when they're doing the distributed network around sites.
Interesting. All right.
Dan, with respect to the core switch type facilities, from an infrastructure deconstruction perspective, our concerns would center on harvesting, the dark equipment and cables, but not impacting that. There's going to be a mix. There's still going to be live traffic in that facility. If you have cable trays that are filled with cable, your vendor who has the reverse logistics recycling piece is very interested in getting every pound of copper they can get, but you don't want to be overeager, because you take the wrong cable, you knock down a great deal of network. So the complexity and the risk of working in the live traffic environment and harvesting dark is one of the key concerns we would have in that scenario.
Yeah, that seems like that's a big challenge, is, having people who are qualified and trained to be going in to do this. You can't just send out, I'm guessing, a regular tower crew to go decommission part of a core of a network. So you have to make sure you get the right people in there. And that comes back to the whole scheduling aspect that you kind of talked about earlier, is making sure you have the right people in the right places to handle these issues. So that's quite a challenge.
One of the topics we talked about in your article is that in the whole decommissioning, deconstruction, you want to use your bullets of tower crews very sparingly, because those are a constrained resource for everyone trying to build the networks, let alone take them down. So you have tower climbers, keep them on towers. Use civil skills for the rest if you can, or non-climbing skills.
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, we got a lot more questions, but we are about a minute out of time here. So instead of trying to cut somebody off with the questions here, what we'll probably do is we'll share these questions with our panel members. Perhaps they can follow up with some of the listeners or the watchers offline as well with some of these too. But again, I did want to thank our panel members again for the time today and the insights. Thanks so much for the great information today, guys. And also to let everybody know that, again, this webinar goes along with the report we are putting out. Like I mentioned earlier, should be coming out, I think, later today or tomorrow morning. Should be on our site. And again, it kind of goes well with the webinar. We touched on some topics here that we didn't get to in the report, and the other way around as well. So I think check out the report and maybe reviewing the webinar if you need to. Will at least provide you a good insight into kind of where we are when it comes to decommissioning efforts and deconstructing the network at this point. But again, thanks guys so much for the time today and the insight. And like I said, feel free to check back on the RCR Wireless site and be able to get a replay on this and also download the report. So again, thanks so much, guys, for the time. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Yeah.
All right,
Thank you.
thanks.
Appreciate it.
Thanks so much.